What's wrong with our approach to technology, and why should we care? If that's a question that interests you, then stick around, because this is something that I've been thinking about for quite a while now, probably for too long, and I'm going to try to lay out some of my thoughts in the next few minutes. Firstly, we need to understand what the current mindset towards technology even looks like if we want to evaluate whether or not that's a good thing, whether or not anything needs to change, and if it does need to change, in what way. We should probably also look at how we got to this stage, because technology, and especially modern technology and the internet, haven't been around for very long at all. So it's quite not easy to summarise how we got here, but we can do a quick run through and ask some questions that probably weren't asked while we adopted a lot of these different types of technologies. And then lastly, I'd like to attempt to outline a framework by which we can maybe try to approach technology in a different way, both from a design perspective, but also from the perspective of a consumer or a regular person. If anything, this is intended to take an approach which moves us away from a consumer mindset and more towards one of using technology in a more long-lasting way, where the devices that we use or the tools that we use aren't really consumables anymore, because that's really what they've become. So what's the problem? What's wrong with how we're looking at it today? With the rapid increase and the rapid growth of manufacturing and manufacturing processes in technology, we've seen the number of people and the number of devices per person increase rapidly. So for perspective, when I was young, when I was growing up, we had one desktop PC in the family and one laptop very early on. I remember a desktop and then a laptop, and my mum and dad would have early mobile phones, so like flip phones or whatever. And that was about it. Maybe a games console as well, something specific like that. And that was generally how it worked. And as children, we would get pretty limited access to the computers. I don't think we ever really used the laptop. It was mostly the desktop, and even then it was just like we would play a game or whatever. We weren't on it for a long time at all. Whereas nowadays, the family technology looks very different, because while we didn't have mobile devices, I suppose we had mobile games consoles. That was definitely a thing, but they didn't have the same capabilities, and they didn't open the same world, I suppose. And they also weren't as consumable in the same way. You obviously bought game cartridges for them, but the Nintendo DS had a massive lifespan. The Game Boy system had a massive lifespan compared with the likes of iPhones right now. But that's really what I wanted to talk about, is that you now have multiple laptop devices per family quite often, or even at minimum, even lower income families, everyone will have a mobile phone, and it'll be capable of a lot more than what the laptops were when I was growing up. I heard a guy speak recently, just in passing, who said that his phone had 16 gig of RAM. That is insane. What is that? My laptop doesn't even have that now. I don't know what you're using that for. But that's besides the point. The point I'm making is that the consumption of technology has increased drastically. It's not just buy it once and it lasts you like 10 years. And so what this really boils down to is that products are made with a shorter life cycle. And that's not even, I wouldn't even say it's to do with the acceleration of computing power, because I think the difference in a 2011 laptop to the same sort of price range of laptop now, they're worlds apart, right? But if you were to compare the same thing with something from 2017, that's not really the case. Like a high-end laptop from 2017 fares pretty well nowadays, because we're making vast improvements, but the need isn't as high. You know, we're not running crazy things all the time, but the same can't be said for things like mobile phones. Some people replace their phone every 2 years, and that's kind of to do with how contracts are set up. This is something that I hadn't really considered as much myself, because I've never been on a kind of contract where the phone was included. I've always had a phone contract that was purely based on the SIM. And my contract's £5 a month, by the way. That's just going to mention that. But some people are on these higher end contracts where every couple of years you get a new phone. And now, I get it, from a consumer perspective, that seems good, right? Because you're always getting something new, you're getting something that's been updated. It's, you want to be getting a bargain, or whatever. But when you think about that, it means that the life cycle of these phones, the life cycle is shortened. And so it's almost assumed at this point that you're only going to have a phone for a couple of years, and then you're going to buy a new one. Which isn't great from a design perspective, because if you assume that someone's going to replace their phone, then they don't need to be able to upgrade it. The companies that are making these devices are far more interested in the profits that they're making, and that makes sense, because they're public companies. You know, Apple is publicly traded. They want to do well. They want to make a profit for their shareholders. It makes sense. But in that, they sacrifice a lot of reliability, upgradability, and repairability, and those are some of the key points that I'm going to come back to in a second when we outline a kind of future vision for technology. And so, even if we view from a financial perspective, if you're on these kind of contracts, it's a bit more like renting. It's not, you're going through a third party, and you're kind of paying off your phone, aren't you? I don't know specifically if it is a full rent kind of scenario, or if you're actually paying it off and you own it at the end. I don't think you do. I think you trade it back. But if you approach it from another angle, where you were to actually purchase the phone, then that becomes expensive really quickly, because, like I say, the phones are designed to only last a certain amount of time before they're replaced. So that's one of the motivations for actually approaching technology in this manner, of this sort of consumer mindset. And there are a lot of different reasons, or there are a lot of different factors that would motivate that. So one of the things would be status, right? It's kind of like having a nice car. Having an iPhone, for whatever reason, has become quite a status symbol now. And I remember I heard it on the radio when I was driving to work one day, that there was some kind of study done on the attractiveness of men from the perspective of women based on mobile phone. So, the conclusion reached was that that the guys with iPhones were more likely to attract women, which is just bizarre. It's kind of funny, but also not good. And that's quite possibly one of the weirdest angles I can take on this, right? Because all of a sudden, like, forget, trying to be charismatic and, a nice person or whatever. Just buy an iPhone. That increases your chances of attracting a woman. That's so weird. But it's pretty funny. So that's one factor, the kind of psychological factor. And this applies to many industries, not just technology. But for a more technology-specific reason, we do have that operating system requirements are being changed now in a way which is, beneficial to the manufacturers of circuit boards or motherboards or chipsets. Intel and AMD, really, they're the main ones, right? So Apple has done this for a while, where their operating system will only run on certain hardware, and that is a way of Apple guaranteeing that you're only going to run it on their own machines. That's what they want. They've got this really enclosed system. But it also means that newer versions of their operating system, they can decide, if you've got a MacBook from 2017, even if it can technically run, even if there are no technical reasons why it couldn't run the next operating system, or the next iteration of the operating system, they can just decide, we don't want to support these anymore. People with this version of the MacBook, they need to buy a new one. The OS isn't going to work. And as soon as you stop allowing people to update their operating system, then the support issue comes into play, because you could say, what's wrong with just using an older operating system? But people are just going to stop supporting it. People aren't going to write software for it. And so now we're seeing Windows do the same thing. So Windows 11, I think it's possibly the first version of Windows. I don't know if that's correct. I think it is. But I think Windows 11 is the first version of Windows where certain hardware can't use the operating system purely based on what they've defined, not based on any requirements. So when Windows 11 came out, I was running Windows 7 for a long time. I still am, to be fair. Not as my main operating system, but as like a dual boot. And I thought, okay, there's a free upgrade to Windows 11. I might as well try it, seeing as 7 is no longer supported, and a lot of software is starting to break now. And despite having a very despite having quite a powerful desktop PC, I wasn't able to upgrade just purely based on the age of the hardware. So now you've clearly got partnerships, right? Because it benefits both parties. If Intel or AMD benefit from selling chips, and Microsoft benefit from being paid off by Intel and AMD, then, of course they're going to work together, because that's the for-profit companies. They're publicly traded. They just want to make money. That brings us into redundancy. Now we've got intentional redundancy, where you can buy a system which you would think would last you 10 years, say. And that's reasonable. I want to point that out. Buying a computer and having it last you 10 years is a reasonable goal. I used the ThinkPad T420 all through my university degree. And that came out in 2011. I graduated 2022. It was fine. There was nothing wrong with it, but it wasn't running Windows. I couldn't have done that if it was. And then lastly, a big motivator, especially on desktops and laptops, is poor software development practices. I'm not going to get too in-depth in this, but basically, some of the ways that software is developed nowadays because developers can just make the assumption that they'll have enough memory, or make the assumption that the processor will be powerful enough now. We don't have the same limitations. We used to have very strict limitations when you were writing software for a computer. That's not there anymore. It technically is. If you're using older hardware, it is, but no one's writing software for old hardware. They're all writing stuff for new hardware, which makes software which should be very basic really difficult to run on more limited systems. So that's another thing that kind of motivates you to buy new hardware. So how did we get to that? Why? Obviously I mentioned the financial incentive, but how were we even able to get to that? We've reached a point where it's now it's almost easier in a lot of senses if you use a lot of more mainstream manufacturers and operating systems. It's almost easier to just replace things rather than repair them, which isn't, from a sustainability perspective, isn't good, but also just in general, you want tools that are going to last. How did we get there? We got there through mass industrialization and globalization. Now, this is going back pretty far, obviously, but the Industrial Revolution really changed the way that we buy and sell things. Because in a pre-industrial society, people mostly had more specific trades where they would do pretty much every part of the job. If you had a product, you could have one guy that makes the entire product, right? But the industrial approach to that is that you have many people working on a single product, but they work on a very small part of that. It's called the division of labour. If you've ever read any Adam Smith, that's what he refers to it as. It's been written about a lot, to be honest. And that's where you have the process split up into many different smaller parts, and have one person focus very specifically on one part of that. And that's only been expanded upon. That's the basis for the entire economy right now, is that factory model. And with the growth of technology, we've also been able to expand that by replacing some of the people in that factory with machines. And so pair that with the recent globalization of the economy, where we now have massive scales. Companies like Amazon, they're just everywhere. They have buildings everywhere. They can do what they want. And then pairing that with differences in economies. So places like China, which, is a powerful country. That's not to be understated, but is still relatively new to the kind of global capitalist economy. And I'm not saying that China is a capitalist country, it's not. They don't have that mindset, but in terms of trying to get ahead of everyone, they were able to really rapidly industrialize, and without the same labour laws that we have, and without the same regulations that we have, they can provide cheaper labour. And so that's obviously why we end up outsourcing a lot of our stuff to Eastern countries. So it's this combination of the industrial process with a global economy where we can get effectively poorer countries or poorer people to work for cheaper, that allows us to produce iPhones for cheaper, or to produce laptops, motherboards, everything. We can produce things rapidly and cheaply, and so it becomes easier and more profitable for these larger companies to just not repair things. And then there's the skill element of it as well. So a regular person doesn't know how to fix a motherboard. It's such a specialised skill. And you can learn it, It is possible. It's not unreasonable for someone to learn how to solder a motherboard. But not everyone's going to do it. It's even less accessible than working on your car, right? Because at least the car is kind of, you interact with that a bit more. Most people that drive a car have some understanding of how it works at a basic level, whereas computers, I think, are so complex now. And the younger generations especially just expect things to work. There's not, you don't see the bare bones stuff behind all these user interfaces and things. You're not exposed to that with modern systems because they've made things so easy to use that there's no need to expose them. So before I go on too long, I want to try and outline a rough framework for how we might approach technology with a less consumerist mindset. And firstly, I'll mention the concepts that I brought up earlier, which is, firstly, repairability. When you're selecting something to purchase, or if we were to design an ideal piece of technology, it would be something which is repairable in a sensible way, in that you can access each of the components, they can be removed, it's modular in some kind of sense. And by that I mean technically a MacBook is repairable. You can repair a MacBook, but Apple make it very difficult. Lewis Rossman on YouTube talks about this endlessly because he's a Mac repair guy, and it's just getting worse and worse to the point where it's almost impossible to keep up an independent repair company if you specialise in MacBooks. And the second part is being upgradable, so that fits again into the modular idea, where you can not only repair something if it's broken, but you can replace it if it's outdated. So that would apply to things like RAM, things like storage. It needs to be easy to swap these things out. You can't make it impossible. Like soldered in RAM is just unnecessary. It's silly. You don't need that. Have the RAM be swappable. Suddenly you can sell a base model for your laptop at a cheaper price. It might make more sales that way. But in future, if they need more RAM, they can just have more RAM. It makes so much more sense. Same with CPUs. If you can swap out the CPU, that's great. I did that in my T420. Swapped out from an i5 to an i7. Big performance boost. It's great. It was easy. There was nothing complicated to it. Nothing soldered in. You just pull the laptop apart, pull it out, stick some thermal paste on, you're good to go. Easy. That's how it should be. That's the kind of ideal. So, yeah, it should be repairable and upgradable in a sensible way where you don't need a bunch of weird tools to do it. And with that comes function over form. So one of the trends lately is really thin laptops. The MacBook Air kind of pioneered this. It didn't pioneer it, but it certainly popularised it. Thin laptops are a nightmare. Thin anything technology is a nightmare because the smaller you make something, the more sacrifices you have to make in terms of function. I would rather have many ports and be able to open my laptop than have 2 USB-C ports and it's like a bit thinner. Next, software selection. This is a big part of it. I think a lot of people underestimate how bad commercial software is. And bad in a lot of ways, but also just like poor in terms of performance. If you look at the free and open source software community, I don't want to call it a community, it's not a community, if you look at the free and open source software range, if you take a look at some of the packages that are available, these are all made by hobbyists. Not all, but mostly made by hobbyists that just want software that works. That's the baseline. They're not trying to make any money off of you. There's no incentive to have weird upgrades or subscriptions. They just want to write software that works. And sure, it can be a bit clunky. It might not be as polished as commercial software, but it'll run on a lot more machines easily. And this includes operating systems. As I mentioned before, Microsoft and Apple, they'll cut deals with other companies. They have motivation to do that. An OS based on Linux, there's no motivation there. They want to support as much hardware as possible. There are ancient machines that still run perfectly fine on Linux. It's built to be efficient. That's why they use it in service. And another point, more on a sustainability perspective, is to buy second-hand technology. This is something that I've almost always done. I don't buy a lot of new things. I'm a big fan of buying second-hand things. And not necessarily just because it's cheaper, but also it makes sense. If you can get older hardware to run more effectively because you've chosen better software, then you don't need anything that's brand spanking new. Like I say, old ThinkPad, if you've got the right software on it, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but running the Windows equivalent, I don't even know if Windows 10, I think it does. I think Windows 10 probably does run on a 2011 ThinkPad, but I wouldn't want to use it. It wouldn't be able to work. It's not designed to work. So with the right software, you can get some really cheap hardware used. And here's another point. In terms of the design ideals that we just outlined, what kind of laptops and computers follow those designs? Enterprise ones, business ones. So we've got this weird separation between business grade technology and consumer grade technology. The business grade stuff is just always designed better, because that's how businesses use them. They don't want to have to replace stuff as often as a consumer could. So yeah, always look at the business line of things. So things like Lenovo ThinkPads, Dell, I've forgotten what the Dell ones are called right now, the HP Ultrabooks. These are all much better designed laptops than what you would get on the consumer end of things, because they don't expect consumers to open the laptops. And then finally, reevaluate what your needs are. I think a lot of people use technology purely for the sake of it, and I understand from a hobby perspective, because I've got a bunch of different machines here, but try to go based on, consider what you can do without. Sometimes it works out better for you. Sometimes it's better to restrict yourself in that sense. There's a lot of benefit to using technology which stops you from using some of the trash that's been developed in recent years. And with that said, I will provide a few warnings with this framework. So firstly, it seems like a fairly simple framework, but the execution can be quite difficult. Obviously, you can run into issues with used technology. Sometimes it's not as described, sometimes it's been abused. That's just something, I guess, that comes with experience and scouting out whatever it is you're buying. And the less technical you are, the less you know about programming or operating systems or electronics, the less you know about these things, the more difficult it gets. That just goes for anything. If you're buying a car, the less you know about the mechanics of a car, the more difficult it's going to be. That's just the reality of it. So, I guess if you want to take it seriously, then I recommend that you start learning about how things work, because that's not only is it extremely useful, but it's fun. It's fun to be able to make technology do what you want it to do, and especially is extremely rewarding to be able to take something that might have been thrown away or might have been deemed as unusable and then make it do something really useful. I think that's one of the best things about this framework, or this idea, is that you can really get the most out of things. And that's what I want to do. So thanks for listening. I hope I haven't rambled on too long. If you're still listening, then thanks very much. Let me know your thoughts. If you have any perspectives on this yourself, let me know anything you've built. Yeah. See ya.